Welcome back to Chapter 1, a podcast where I sit down and talk about media, specifically films, books, and music. And I like to look at these things from an emotional perspective and connect them to what I like to call the human connection or life. So let's get into it. Today we're talking about the 2001 film Donnie Darko, which, if you haven't seen, please stop listening and go watch it, because it's such a life-altering film in such a deep, creepy, dark way. But if you have seen it, I'm excited to talk about this with you and see if anything that has hit with me has also hit with you. And yeah, this film was directed by Richard Kelly, who I just found out was 25 when he directed this film, which blows my mind. Like, what a powerhouse. He also directed The Box, which is also a really fun sci-fi thriller. A totally fresh concept that I love, but we're here to talk about Donnie Darko. And this film is based in 1988, stars Jake Gyllenhaal, who is so young in this film. I'm not even sure how young he was when he filmed this, but he looks so young and absolutely destroys this role and is so inspiring. And I want to mention too, the rest of the cast did such an incredible job as well. It felt like every single person involved in this film was so dedicated to their role, and it didn't matter how big or small their role was. It was just so refreshing to see, and I love that I connected with that. So the film is based in 1988, which is really fun in itself, and it feels like it pulls from that era of sci-fi for sure. And when I first saw this film, I was 16 or 17. My friend was like, "You have to watch this movie. It's so strange." So I went over to her house and we threw in the VHS. Yes, a VHS. And we watched it. And not only was I absolutely in love with Jake Gyllenhaal, but I had never seen something like this before. So it kind of rocked my world and has honestly set the standards for a lot of different films. Because the feeling that I had after watching this the first time, it changed my life. Not to be dramatic, but when considering films, it really did set a standard that was pretty high for me, because I really enjoyed the way that I felt after it. Even though it was uncomfortable. It was an uncomfortable relationship, but I was like, I like this. And we can get into why that is, but that is very personal, so maybe not. But yeah, I sat down to watch this movie with my friend, and at the time, if you had told me that it was a sci-fi thriller, I'd have been like, absolutely not. This is a horror movie. This is horror. Because there are images and visuals in this film that are shocking, and I still get very uncomfortable with them years and years later. Now that I've watched it, I probably watched it 15 times in my lifetime. I'm much more comfortable with it. I'm desensitized. Not 100% though. There is still that like ping of tension in my system when I see certain things in this film. And if I really allow that feeling to expand and get into me, I have to pull the plug at some point, because I could very easily see it consuming me for a long time and then just inspiring my reality. So anyway, back to this film, 1988. It follows a high school teenager through these events that are just, they make no sense, but they all align perfectly with each other, and Jake Gyllenhaal's character, Donnie Darko, is given these problems and solutions seamlessly, so it flows really nicely throughout the film. But when I first saw this film, I was left with a total, what the fuck did I just watch kind of feeling, because in the theatrical version, there's very little explained, and I really enjoy that. I've seen the director's cut as well, and it's much more obvious. There's still mystery to it and all of that really fun stuff, but as a viewer, I enjoy both of them. I enjoy both versions. I think the theatrical version leaves more to the imagination, so I tend to lean towards enjoying that one more. I watched it again the other night in prep for this episode, and I'm continuing to see things that I have not seen or picked up on before, which could be, and probably is, a testament to where my mindset and my perspective is now. But I really love media that can grow with me throughout my life. I've spoken about a few different things that have done that to me, and I think that that's such a testament to the creators. And I think Richard Kelly was really passionate about this film and just killed it in a good way. So I actually just read an article about the creation of this film and how, as a 25-year-old director, he felt like he didn't have a lot of people that trusted him on the set. In this article, he tells this really beautiful story about this vision he has for the scene where we're introduced to the majority of the cast. It is set to Tears for Fears' Head Over Heels, which is a really fun song, and because of this film, I associate it with Donnie Darko and nothing else. Tears for Fears is great. They're really fun. But in that article, he was talking about how until they shot that scene, which they did in the first week of the production, until they shot that scene, had it developed into a VHS, and then the cast and crew saw it, Richard Kelly was saying that he really didn't think that people had a lot of trust in him, and he could actually see people turn from not trusting him to fully trusting him in his vision, which must have been so magical. When I think about a creative project and having a team full of people that don't see it the way that you do, that can create a lot of tension in your system. And then obviously you're putting that energy out, and other people are just like, what are we doing here? So until you all get on the same page, it's really like a shot in the dark. And there's a lot of trust that has to happen. Imagine the money that's dedicated to this, the time that's dedicated to this. And to be in Richard Kelly's shoes at 25, I'm just imagining my 25-year-old self and how I was not directing movies. I was running around just doing whatever I wanted, which was fun and great and I loved. But I don't think I would have had the confidence to be like, I'm going to direct a film. A film that is so different. And so I just feel lucky. I just feel lucky to be on the planet while this film is was being created, and it's still, it's in this permanent form now, and so like we get to enjoy it for the rest of our lives. I just feel lucky. I think that's great. So with all of that said, this film is really interesting, different, and I highly recommend it. But we'll kind of go over the themes that are in this film, and I'll touch on the plot. I don't want to deep dive into the plot and tell you every single detail because I don't have the patience for that, one. And two, I want you to have that for yourself. Essentially, this film follows a high school teenager who is already going through major life things like puberty and social expectations and all this family dynamics and all of this other really normal human stuff. But on top of that, we find out that his character is suffering from mental health issues, and he is taking action on those by seeing a therapist and taking medication. We find out in the beginning that his relationship with his medication is a little rocky, and so that is resulting in these other things that happen throughout the film. This cast does such a good job of creating tension, and also they just do a great job of creating emotion and influencing the viewer. On top of that, this time around, I really noticed that the score has a lot of really simple tones. So there's like the soundtrack where there are these major names like Tears for Fears, but the additional sound that's happening on the film too. And I'd love to get into it with like a Hertz reader or something to see what really is happening. But I was picking up on sounds that were influencing my emotion, which I just love. I love that layer, and like they're really subtle. It's just like, you know, a tone in the background of a scene, but it impacts you. And I love that. I love that layering, and I love that that's something that I haven't picked up on before, and now I am, and that has a lot to do with the things that I'm exploring with sound healing and stuff. But it's so smart. It's so intelligent to have that in there. And so this creative team they absolutely killed it. But those help us understand how we're supposed to feel about certain scenes in this movie, which I think is really cool. It's almost making it so obvious to us, which I think is helpful. Because this film is really complex. It's got a lot of layers. Richard Kelly has said there's a lot of Easter eggs that people probably don't pick up on ever, but that he has, and I would love to pick his brain about what those are. But this film is just different, and I appreciate that. I've always been someone who has appreciated things that are just a little bit different because I think it's fun. I get a lot of joy out of that. And so major themes in this film are, from my perspective, time travel, there's a little bit of romance, and a little bit of just what the fuck. Those are the major themes. And time travel has a soft spot in my heart right now just because of my relationship with time and everything that's going on. And this is one of those movies that kind of jars your brain to be like, well, what if it is possible? What if these things that are happening aren't by coincidence? And I like this film because, I've like trolled the internet through different theories and stuff like that, but the one that I like the most is reminding ourselves that in the beginning of this film, there's early on in the film, there's a catastrophic event that happens to Donnie's family where there could have been two very different outcomes from it. The catastrophic event is that a jet engine falls into Donnie's room in the middle of the night, and he actually he's guided by a voice that he hears in his head to wake up right before it happens and leave the house. And so everything that happens after that is an event that potentially would not happen if he hadn't heard this voice calling to him, which I love. I really love sitting back and thinking about that because it scratches my brain in a way maybe that just feels different. And so we followed Donnie Darko through all of these events, which apparently some of them are inspired by actual events that happened to Richard Kelly. The jet engine falling into Donnie's room was inspired by a news story that happened in Richard Kelly's youth of a chunk of ice falling off of an airplane and into someone's house. And so I think that's so interesting that he took that inspiration from that and then created this insane story. So we follow Donnie Darko through all of these events, and it really feels like every problem that's presented to him has a solution, and most of the time he has to take action and is the catalyst for the solution. And yet he's never, a lot of the actions he takes can be viewed as destructive or bad, but he's never caught because things line up just so perfectly for him. Something else happens, or somebody else reacts to the event, which then distracts people from investigating who had created the event and all of these other veins that come out of this. It lines it up so perfectly for Donnie, which is intentional. He's supposed to walk this path. He's supposed to follow this timeline so that he can see the result of him being alive. All of this takes course over, I think it's 28 days. And so we're walked through these 28 days with Donnie Darko and all of these other characters. And at the end of the film is another catastrophic event that happens. One of the characters, Gretchen, who is Donnie Darko's, who becomes Donnie Darko's partner, and who also, I want to say, introduces this really feminine, soft, emotionally aware character who I think really balances out Donnie's what could be seen as chaos. There's a lot of tension in Donnie Darko's character. Jake Gyllenhaal absolutely just destroys it. I'd be curious about his process of getting into the mindset of Donnie Darko, because he just does so well. And I'd be curious about him and Richard Kelly's relationship and how that developed over the process of creating this film. But at the end of the movie, we find out that because of all of these events, all of these steps, all this path, Gretchen passes away pretty traumatically. Very traumatically. When I first saw this scene, it was a lot. And so Donnie is presented with a choice throughout this entire film. Set lots of choices. But the ultimate choice is that he can continue living this timeline of the post-events of the jet engine landing in his room. Or he can decide to remain in his room when the jet engine falls into it. So the time travel thing is an overarching theme, but it's not necessarily laid out in front of you in the theatrical version, which I think is fun. It's briefly mentioned by the voice in Donnie's head. And the voice in Donnie's head is a guide who leads him to all of these choices that he needs to make in order for things to be laid out perfectly in order for this traumatic event at the end of the film to happen. And so the guide is almost a character that they are a character that you dislike. Like, the way that they create this character visually is disturbing. His voice is disturbing, and it's interesting how they tie him into the rest of the story. And the way that they button it up at the end is really smart. It's enjoyable and really brain itching. So it's clear that Donnie has to make a choice of either staying on this timeline post jet engine falling into his room and him escaping it, or staying in his room and not escaping it. And I think this time around when I watched this, it was very obvious to me that he was really struggling with these events happening. And so he was super confused and didn't understand them. And I think that pretty early on, he realizes what needs to happen, but it hasn't really set in. You know, when you have a thought and you're like, oh, I think that thing needs to happen, but you're almost in denial for a little bit, which could be a protection thing. But eventually you're like, okay, I really need to sit down and figure this thing out. Whatever it may be. Could be, I need to go to the grocery store, but I don't want to. And then you procrastinate, and then, you get to it eventually, and it's totally fine. But it's almost like a weight that sits on you. And I think that feeling comes across in this film. Like, there's a lot of doom and gloom, and I think that Donnie is kept in this state of confusion to inspire him to take a certain action. And at the end of the theatrical version, Donnie is looking at this choice in a positive light. He's accepting that he needs to sacrifice himself basically in order to get this universe back on track, which is high level shit. I think it is, as a human being, one of the ultimate sacrifices, and I think it's really interesting, and also really depends on your relationship to death. we're led to believe that Donnie's relationship with death is really unique. It doesn't necessarily feel super good or bad. I think that he's a little turned away from it, but as we move through the timeline of this film, he slowly becomes much more comfortable with it, and ultimately leads to him sacrificing himself in order to allow the universe to get back on track so that all of this suffering doesn't follow, which is such an interesting perspective to think about. There are themes of fear and love, and those being the ultimate factors for choice in this movie, which I think is really interesting too, because I think that a lot of choices that we make are based in those two things. I don't think that it's so black and white, but I think that those things inspire us to make choices and to lead our lives. And we could go on. I could go on for days about that, but for brevity and for your ears, I'll say that I think it's an interesting perspective. This film is a good one. Yeah, I would definitely check it out if you haven't already. I kept it kind of vague here, and it really is just so dense with information and visuals and sounds, and it's really a work of art, I think. And truthfully, the article that I read mentioned that Richard Kelly might revisit the Donnie Darko universe one day, which really excites him. And part of me really wishes that happened like 3 or 4 years ago, when Stranger Things started to become a really big thing, and then we all kind of decided to collectively go back into the 80s with our media. I think it would have hit so hard then, but maybe not. Maybe Stranger Things was such a force that I wonder if this would have gotten lost. So I'm really hopeful that Richard Kelly is going to release something in this universe again, because Donnie Darko was so cool. It still is so cool. I wish I could go back and watch it for the first time again, because now that I've seen the director's cut and all of that, I kind of have access to a lot of information that relieves me of my initial reaction to it, which was so substantial and powerful. But yeah, I mean, if you haven't seen it, please go watch it. My emotional reactions to Donnie Darko initially were fear and disgust, and it was just really interesting. So curiosity was in there too. So like, think about fear, disgust, and curiosity. Like, that might say a lot about me, but now my reaction is curiosity. I'm so attracted to this because I'm lucky to have witnessed it happening in this lifetime, and just overall appreciation for it, because it's so brave. And yeah, it's just so brave. And Richard Kelly he trusted himself in this, and you can really feel it throughout the film. It's fun visually, it's fun aesthetically, it's just a fun movie, and I think if it's not on your list, it absolutely has to be, even for the bare minimum of like Jake Gyllenhaal being in it. If that's your only interest in it, give it a whirl. But thank you so much for joining me. This is kind of a shorter episode. I could talk about Donnie Darko for days and days, and maybe I will on a future episode, but for now, it's a sci-fi thriller that was released in 2001 that didn't get a lot of traction. It's a cult classic now. I absolutely adore it. I love when I see things in the world that remind me of it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Bye!